Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mitchell Barrett, and welcome to my presentation. Well, that was Love Me Do, which was the first hit single by the Beatles on October 5th, 1962. It topped out on the charts on number 17, and that's when the Beatles were born. Even though the Beatles broke up in 1970, their legacy continues to live on many generations since then. But why did they continue that legacy? Today we're going to take a brief look at the startup and breakup of the Beatles and how their legacy has transformed the music that we listen to today. We're going to begin with the breakout and the development of the Beatles in the early 60s. Then we're going to take a look at the later albums and their actual demise and their breakup in the 1970s. And then finally, we're going to look at the legacy of the Beatles since then and what they mean today. But first, we're going to have to go back to Liverpool, England in the early 1960s. Clubs like the Cavern Club were usually exclusively jazz clubs back in the early 60s, until the advent of skiffle, which was an early version of rock and roll that used elements of jazz and blues. The Beatles, before they formed, were actually in a band called the Quarrymen that was kind of the forefather of the band. Brian Epstein would actually discover the Beatles as they played at the Cavern Club in the early 60s and signed them to a contract where they began to produce hit after hit of music that we still listen to today. Also, they began to write music and star in their own movies such as A Hard Day's Night and Help. In 1963, the British invasion made its way over to the United States, where the Beatles came over and began playing in front of crowds in the United States. It started with the Ed Sullivan Show in 1963, and they would play in front of thousands and thousands of people in places such as Shea Stadium. When they returned to England and began writing their next few albums, they began to experiment with new sounds on their albums such as Rubber Soul and Revolver. But they would get away from their basic pop songs and love songs, your standard typical chorus, verse, solo, chorus, and began to go into a deeper experimentation with their music. But after Revolver, they began to go a little bit deeper into that experimentation, and soon they would release one of the greatest albums of all time. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released on May 26, 1967, to intense praise by both critics and fans alike. But unfortunately, after the release of this album, tensions began to run high with the band, with many members quitting, becoming back with the band, quitting again. That culminated with the Abbey Road and Let It Be sessions. On April 10th, 1970, Paul McCartney announced that he was leaving the band permanently and the others would follow shortly thereafter. Let It Be was released 1 month later, and that would be the last album that the Beatles would release together as a band. So after the breakup in the 1970s, the former members began the recording solo. Even though they weren't together anymore, their music continued to live on as solo artists and their music as a band together. That legacy would go on forever. Paul McCartney, with his new band Wings, would release Band on the Run in the early 70s, and George Harrison would have many solo hits, including the seminal album All Things Must Pass. John Lennon had probably what many say is the best solo album of the remaining Beatles, with Imagine. Unfortunately, John Lennon's life would be cut short on December 8th, 1980, by a deranged fan named Mark David Chapman, who murdered him. At the end of the 1980s, George Harrison, with his friends Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, Roy Orbison, and Bob Dylan, formed the supergroup the Traveling Wilburys and produced 2 albums that had many, many hit singles. Unfortunately, George Harrison would die a little too young as well, as he died on November 29, 2001 of lung cancer. So how has the Beatles' legacy continued on, even with new generations of music lovers being born? Well, on September 9th, 2009, they released a box set of all the remastered albums in their catalog. On the same day, they would release the Beatles Rock Band video game, which gave younger audiences who played video games an opportunity to listen and see what the Beatles were all about, and they became brand new fans of the Beatles by playing the music in the game. So that was a brief look at the rise and fall and the legacy of the Beatles. We saw that the quick rise of the greatest band on earth and then the quick demise of the group through arguments and other reasons that they broke up. But that legacy continues today, and we saw that there are many reasons such as video games and released box sets. It's inarguable that what their place is in the history of rock and roll. No singer or band has ever had the lasting image that the Beatles have had on music. Thank you very much. My name is Mitchell Barrett, and I appreciate you watching my presentation.